Hello, I'm Mick Garris, and I'd like to thank you for joining us once again in this special series of major science fiction blockbuster films. Tonight is one of the most popular science fiction films of all time, Close Encounters of the Third Kind, the special edition. And we're lucky to have with us the writer and director of the film, Steven Spielberg. Steven, thanks for being here.
Nice being here.
The first thing I guess would be the most obvious question: why take a hugely successful film, one of the most successful films of all time, and rework it for re-release?
Well, it was a really combination of a lot of things. The first impulse that hit me was that when the movie was released, I was locked into a release date in November of 1977. And because of that, there were a lot of things I wanted to do with the film I didn't have time to do. A lot of editing choices I didn't really have time to think about. I had to finish the picture very, very quickly. And everything had to do with the special effects. We were rushing the effects out and rushing the picture out. And essentially, I only really had 2 previews of the picture. And the previews worked very well, and everybody felt we had a successful picture, which in fact we did, but it wasn't what I had originally written. It wasn't 100% of what I had written. It was perhaps 80% of my original notion, years before '77. And there were 3 or 4 scenes that I had written many years before that I never had a chance to actually shoot and put in the movie. So I went to Columbia, and I suggested to them that when they did redistribute the film, which is always the case with a successful picture, they'd like to reissue. I said, let me go out and shoot my original script, and we get those scenes in, and they agreed.
I guess when a film has done over $100 worth of business, the luxury of another couple of million is easy to rationalize.
Yeah, and also it gave them what they felt would be a selling handle. It gave me the chance to make my movie the way I would have intended, the way I intended to make it years before, and it gave them a chance to perhaps make a few more dollars on it, and all of us, for that matter.
And it seems more appealing than just a standard re-release.
Oh, yeah,
something more special.
It was more appealing, and also it was, there's a notion about films that I don't quite agree with, and that's when the paint's dry, walk away and leave it alone. And you can always change clay, and I think films should be pliable, and you should have the opportunity to play with movies years after they've been television re-edits pictures constantly, and sometimes for the better and sometimes not for the better. But
can you see yourself doing this in the future as well?
If I make a project I feel strongly about, as I feel toward Close Encounters, yes, I probably would play with it years after the release, whether the film was successful or not.
Close Encounters seems to be a very personal sort of film in a lot of ways, something that meant a lot to you. One of the questions we always ask on this show is about the genesis of the film. How did the whole thing come about? Well,
the whole idea started with a short film I made when I was about 15 years old. I was making 8mm movies then, and I was living in Phoenix, Arizona, and I made a picture called Firelight, and it was about UFOs. And I've been a UFO, not a fanatic, but I've been curious about the possibility of extraterrestrial life coming here, and also certainly curious about the probability of life elsewhere. And I made this movie. It was 2.5 hours long, and Close Encounters is actually the sequel to a film I made like in 1963.
Well, the film seems very well researched. Every time you hear about a close encounter or a UFO sighting, it seems to be something that has ended up in your film. How heavily did you go into the reports, the eyewitness report?
Well, I researched it, but you know, there is not a great deal of information available about ufology. There are experts on the scene like Dr. Hynek, who we employed as a technical consultant, and Jacques Vallée, and people like Stanton Friedman, and even Carl Sagan Carl Sagan is much more of a practical scientist and philosopher. But I really had to, my source material was kind of cheesy. They don't write scientific journals about UFO reports. It's not exactly the most pursued topic in science today. So a lot of it came from strange comic ideas I would hear about, or a lot of the ideas, or not the ideas for the scenes, but a lot of the research I did really came from sightings that were not altogether well-founded. I've researched a few myself and debunked a few myself, and a few I couldn't explain. And then Dr. Hynek came on board after the script had been written, and he was very beneficial in reading a scene and saying, well, that is absolutely into science fiction, but this is more like what I have been researching. And I wanted to keep a real verisimilitude throughout Close Encounters. It was very important to balance the reality. This was happening to a suburban family in real life, as opposed to happening to people who were perhaps not as realistic as the character Dreyfus portrays.
This was happening to people who should be in that audience watching the film.
No, it was happening to people who eat Wheaties for breakfast and go to movies at night and watch Dallas, and it was that sort of...
Now, the thing that made the film as magical as it is not only the characterizations, but the special effects. Now, you have a credit for the conception of many of the visual concepts. Let's talk a little bit about those and how they were different from, well, Star Wars, obviously, a few months before.
Yeah, well,
very different look.
Yeah, I mean, there are two different kinds of special effects, certainly. I kind of think of Close Encounters as being a real terrestrial movie as opposed to a highly extraterrestrial movie such as Star Wars or Star Trek. And Close Encounters, the whole special effects concept was very simply that I worked on the notion for the mothership and what the UFO should look like and what color light they should have and how amorphous they should look. And most of that was essentially my design, working through an artist named George Jensen. We worked together. He was like on staff as an illustrator. We worked together for a full year before anyone else came on the picture. Doug Trumbull, Dick Urasich, any of the fellows working out of Future General. That was the subsidiary of Paramount, the company that we employed to physically realize the special effects.
To do your Columbia picture.
To do our Columbia picture, exactly. And so I essentially began work on the effects a year before the technical geniuses, such as Doug Trumbull, came to work on the film. And then when Doug came on the film, he took those ideas and just made them into wonderful magic.
Right, and Doug will be with us for 2001, so.
Oh yeah, Doug's the best. He's great.
Right, now, if you're at all like me, you were brought up on the science fiction films of the 50s, in which all the aliens are a threat to be destroyed when they come to Earth. There is nothing friendly about them, I guess a lot of them representing the communist invasion and all that. Now, Close Encounters is perfect for the end of the 70s and the 80s. It's a very wistful, very friendly, longing look at alien life. Now, what's the difference? How did our perceptions change?
I don't know, because I was alive and well when they were making Earth versus flying saucers, and they were making pictures about teenagers necking in a forest, and strange creatures would come out of the trees and kill them both. Yeah, I was around for that, and I never really stood behind that. You know, just I never really endorsed those beliefs that extraterrestrials are 100% hostile. I've always had a feeling that if anybody was smart enough to get here, they would be smart enough to take the next step, which would be to communicate and understand and not necessarily laser us out of existence.
When you were a kid, were you hopeful to meet a...
Yeah, I was sort of a wimpy kid, you see. So as a little wimpy kid, I didn't want a bully to come down and scare me. I wanted to shake someone's hand bigger than me and get invited on their ship and go off for a ride. I was actually always very pacifistic about that belief. One
of the specific things about your films is the characterizations are very real and very empathetic to a general audience, to the masses. Some of the things you do to get those performances are interesting. Now, Kerry Guffey's look of complete wonder and awe as he first sees whatever is out there is really interesting. Would you like to tell us how that was achieved?
Yeah, I tell you something, I would love to, except for the fact that right after this interview is over, they're going to play the movie. The people who have never seen it before are going to look at that scene, they're going to say, I know why the kid's reacting that way, because. All right. But that's just a little secret, I hate to give out, especially so close to the running of the movie.
Right, yeah, you're right.
There are all sorts of tricks you can play on a child, especially Kerry at the time was almost 4, not quite 4 years old. And I began resorting to tricks when I first met him. I realized he was such an exceptional child that after a week working with him, I dealt with Kerry as I dealt with Dreyfus or Melinda Dillon or Terry Garr or Francois Truffaut as a person, as a very, very intelligent person who could understand what he was supposed to be feeling and what he was supposed to be doing and then carry that out beautifully.
The interesting thing about your directing as well is obviously you have a very cinematic mastery and your relationship with actors. Often directors are one or the other. They direct performances or they direct cinema. What is your background in studying cinema and directing?
Well, my background essentially is, I guess, what everybody's background is today, the directors of today were raised on movies as opposed to theater. I'm not a theater child. I'm a movie or a television watcher. essentially, my background is I studied acting for a couple of years, not to be an actor, but in fact to be a director while I was in college, and tried acting, of course, failed miserably at it, but had that experience behind me, and wanted very much to direct. And when you direct, the best way to do it is just go out and direct, and experience taught me everything. Experience before I ever became a professional filmmaker. I was making films from the age of 12 on to today, and you learn, I think, more by getting out there and rolling up your sleeves with a 8mm movie camera and photographing your 12-year-old friends than essentially you do going to the best universities and the best acting classes in the world. That is something that is just assimilated over experience and time.
Now, you began directing for network television at the age of 21 with the likes of Joan Crawford and all. Was that an intimidating experience for you?
Sure. How would you feel if the first person you were asked to direct was the formidable Joan Crawford? That was
intimidated.
It was the most frightening experience of my entire life. Nothing has come up to it except maybe directing Jaws was slightly more frightening than directing Joan Crawford. But she was wonderful, and she treated me like I was George Cukor, or she treated me as if I was Raoul Walsh. I mean, I had a lot of respect from her because she had a old school professionalism about respecting the director, no matter how many pimples he has on his face. And I had plenty in 1969.
And your voice was cracking.
And my voice was cracking, and the crew was laughing, and like, this kid's not going to make it past the 8th day. And in fact, I was about a day behind schedule, and the executives began coming down and watching to make sure I didn't go 2 days over schedule, and it was quite a traumatic experience.
How did you make that transition from television on Night Gallery and things of that sort? Duel was a TV movie here, theatrical in Europe. And then Sugarland Express, then Jaws.
Right.
Huge change.
Yeah, well, a change, yeah. It was just a process of finding scripts. Sugarland was a story that I had written and I wanted to make for a long time. And after I directed Duel, Duel was on television and in Europe popular enough that people began coming to me and saying, now you've done about 11 TV shows, how about doing a feature? And I was being offered feature scripts, and rather than doing someone else's movie, I've always preferred to do my own films, and I pulled Sugarland out of the drawer and made that next for Universal. And then Jaws was essentially because the producers of Sugarland were the producers of Jaws.
Right, exactly.
And they wanted to work with me again, and I wanted to work with them, and Jaws came along.
It was quite a plum.
Yeah, it was a plum, and it was good timing, and I guess it was lucky I grabbed that subject. But in actuality, Jaws is very similar to Duel. In terms of structure and intensity. It's a very similar story, so I wasn't exactly going into sort of a strange land from Duel. I felt in effect that I was making just an extension of the land shark I was making now, a water shark movie.
Now, the success of Jaws led to a situation where you could do anything you wanted, really. Is that true?
Well, up to a point. I mean, anybody can do anything they want until they, in fact, want to make the telephone book, and then someone says, who has a lot of money and to give to you, says, no, I really don't think the telephone book would make a very good movie.
Right, but along came Close Encounters, a big budget film, which led to 1941, also a big budget film. Do you want to talk about the making of spectacular, high budget production?
You know, it takes years, and it takes a lot out of you, and your hair gets gray, and you get very tired, and you get no sleep, and the profits are extraordinary, and the loss is just as extraordinary if it's not successful. And it's big risk filmmaking.
You're ready for a small picture, aren't you?
I've been ready for a small picture for 10 years. 10 years. Yeah.
And you're going to be doing that?
Yeah, eventually. I think my next picture will be a very small picture.
Now, right now, we're just about ready to wrap up. I'd like to touch on Raiders briefly.
Raiders of the Lost Ark.
Right.
Yeah, that's the picture coming out. Paramount produced it. George Lucas was the producer and wrote it with Larry Kasdan, and it's a film coming out in the summer.
Do you want to say anything more about it, or no?
It's a spectacular adventure film. What more can I say?
Okay, with Harrison Ford.
With Harrison Ford and Karen Allen and some wonderful people.
All right, we've been talking with Steven Spielberg. I want to thank you for being with us, Steven, and look forward to Close Encounter. This is the special edition right away.